situation will accompany us for the coming decades as we see it now. So it is an important challenge for all of us. We have to take leave of a vision which we had of a trend movement towards more liberal ideas in pervading our societies, feeling safe within Europe on the foundations of democracy, and rely on the messy but still, we thought, relatively stable evolution of a process of European integration. But this has been changing rapidly with challenges for political scientists, as we have on the panel, to understand the basis of the renewed rise of populism and nationalism, the challenges of regressive trends towards a distortion of democratic processes, as has been discussed already, which exert a pressure and a serious challenge for European integration. For sociologists who have to understand more deeply the cleavages which are based on cultural as well as on economic grounds. And of course, for economists like us, what all this means, the evolution of complex political, social, cultural processes, what that means for economic relations in Europe and beyond that, and of course also for the conduct and design of economic policy. So we are going to discuss in this panel this new juncture of European history in the wake of Russia's war on Ukraine, within this rather fast and difficult to understand change of geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think for this panel, I single out two issues in particular, which we focus on. Basically, on the one hand, the impact of what we have seen, this evolving Russia-Ukraine crisis, on the internal developments within the EU. How it does affect the new moves in terms of policymaking, reforms of policymaking structures, and coordination of policies within the EU. So that's one topic. And the second topic, very much represented also by the know-how of our panelists, is the impact of the war in the Ukraine on future schemes of EU enlargement. Not only accession, but also the design of relationships to its neighborhood. Neighborhood in a rather wide sense, not only Europe, but also beyond that. And this, of course, at the moment includes Ukraine, which is a neighboring country, and how to support Ukraine in the short, medium, and long run. But of course, that will be much more a topic in more detail of the panel, which is just following this one. So let me introduce the panelists, and they will come in the sequence I present them. They will all have time to explore some of the issues in introductory statements, followed by some internal rounds of discussion and opening up to questions and answers. So Debora Revoltella, who you know from, we are thankful to her to come to a number of our activities and conferences and webinars. She's the director of the economics department at the European Investment Bank, which is de facto acting chief economist of the EIB. This department is a large department, about 40 economists involved in it, and it is in charge on risk assessment at the of sovereigns and financial sectors. She was very active in developing the publications and research activities in the Institute, responsible for the EIB investment report, the working paper series, and of course she was behind what is a very good database for us, namely the EIB investment survey, which covers over 12,000 European firms, which is a very asset for us and for many other researchers to analyze business behavior and corporate developments in Central Eastern Europe beyond. She has studied at Bocconi University and Ancona, and prior to the EIB, that means prior to 2011, she was chief economist of Unicredito, responsible for Central and Eastern Europe, chief economist for Central and Eastern Europe at Unicredito, yeah? And was stationed in Vienna, so we know her also from that time. The next speaker will be Maria Demertiz, who will be linked via webinar. She was until very recently deputy director at Bruegel, the well-known think tank, until last December. Now she's still working very actively at Bruegel as senior fellow and is a part-time professor of economic policy at the School of Transnational Governance in Florence at the European University Institute. She, prior to coming to Bruegel, she worked at the European Commission and at the Dutch Central Bank. She also had stints at the Kennedy School of Government in the US, at the University of Strathclyde, where she was doing her PhD, but also teaching. Some of her recent publications show the scope of what she's analyzing and commenting on. Just taking a few examples, she covered recently a commentary on the change of tack of EU-China relations. She worked on how are sanctions against Russia working, the EU's response to the United States Inflation Reduction Act, etc. So she spans really a wide area, as Bruegel does in its rather impressive interventions on analysis and policy suggestions. Florian Bieber will be our next speaker on the extreme right. He's professor of South... Nowadays we have to be cautious about that, yes. Professor of Southeast European History and Politics and Director for the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. In fact, we interact with him, or some of our colleagues interact with him for quite some time. He's coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group and worked prior to that at Kent University, and also teaches now at the Nationalism Studies program at the Central European University. He had many visiting stints at LSE, New York University, etc., Cornell. Recent publications, where you can see also how his intervention here will cover some of these aspects, include a book, Negotiating Unity and Diversity in the European Union, Debating Nationalism, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans. Recently, he co-edited a special issue on internationalism in times of nationalism with a focus on Yugoslavia. Dr. Cengiz Günay is also, we're thankful for you to participate in quite a few events. We're organizing, director of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, our, let's say, sister institute in international relations in political science, ÖIP. He's also teaching at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, was also abroad visiting fellow at Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And of course, his regional focus is Turkey, the MENA region, but he also covers thematically democracy and the rise of new forms of authoritarian governance, quite important in the events which we have witnessed in the last weeks in Turkey, European neighborhood policy and Islamism. He's author of a number of monographs, the history of Turkey, from Islamists to Muslim Democrats, a number of books and many other articles. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to a very exciting discussion.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to say that I'm really happy to be in Vienna today. And for this, I understand it's a big anniversary and a big birthday for the Institute. So I'm very, very, very pleased to be here and to contribute to this discussion. And the way I will actually start with my starting 5 or 6 minutes is to think at where we are now at the European level in terms of economic dynamics following the war and the war in Ukraine, but also looking more at the economic side. So at the end, it means also looking at how Europe is transforming after the energy shock that we have seen, that is so much connected also with the war in Ukraine. And I think where we stand today is after the pandemic, after the war, after the energy shock, we stand in a situation in which Europe has two big issues to solve and to deal with. On the one side, internally, is a matter of competitiveness. It's not a new one. It's decades and decades that we are talking about low potential growth in Europe. And after the shocks that we have seen in the last year, we are back talking at how to deal with European competitiveness, internal competitiveness, in an even more challenging situation because of the consequence of the energy shock, what the energy shock has revealed in terms of vulnerabilities at the European level. And that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that Europe has to position itself in the global competitive environment, where a global competitive environment is even more challenging because of the fragmentation that we have seen, and because the choices that Europe will take now in terms of strategic, if you want, strategic autonomy, security, scaling down in terms of trading, protectionism, you can call it in different ways, but at the end, the deglobalization part will have an effect also in terms of global growth and also in terms of European growth. So the choices are very difficult. The choices in terms of policies are very difficult and very important, and will define the future of Europe and at the world level in many ways. If we look at the internal dimension, so European competitiveness, I think the way I would like to move is to look at how Europe responded to the energy shock, with looking at some factors that are on the positive side and some that still leave room to adjustment. But on that side, I think so far, we have been surprised on the upside in terms of the transformation that we have seen in the last year. I think at the very beginning of the energy shock, the possibility of decoupling from Russian gas so quickly and with so little economic consequences at the end. We saw a lot of economic consequences, but much less than what we originally saw. I think was not so, not everybody was believing in that. So we managed to decouple from Russian gas at a moment in which hydro and nuclear were extremely low in the production, and we managed with a different instrument. On the one side, reopening other sources of gases, reopening with LNG, but also developing a new, very fast LNG instrument facilities. And with reopening also on coal, that probably is less on the positive side, but we also saw a very strong reduction in demand, and extremely successful policies in terms of energy efficiency that were unprecedented in terms of size, and even beating the targets. We also saw at the start a number of the uncertainty was somehow leading, and uncertainties, if you can also call panic, at some paces was also increasing the effect of the shock. If you think at the moment in which everybody was trying to refill the storage last winter, it was a moment in which prices were, because everybody was beating once against the other in an uncoordinated way, that also led to some spikes in terms of prices. But then it was quickly understood, and the common solution at the European level took place. And the common solution was important, partly bringing forward the idea of common procurements that this year is making completely different the way in which member states are working into the refilling storage, with actually much less tension in the market. We have seen that the very strong push for the net zero transition that recame as a top policy priority at the European level gave somehow a guidance in terms of policy of how to move. And also we saw the very strong push for renewable energy, again energy efficiency. And another point that while looking at the beginning, there was a lot of concern on a few countries that may be excluded from the network if interconnectors were not built super quickly, but in fact these interconnectors were built quickly, so no country was left completely behind in the moment of the energy shock. So to me, in fact, the last year Europe may have been lucky in some part, but it also showed that there was somehow coming a bit a European way, coming up at some moment more direct than others, but there was a common solution coming up. But it's not finished. I think on the energy market, we see the new dependency coming up. We see the risk of remaining fragmentation of the market and the shortfall bottlenecks in the system that remain. And the fact that at the European level, we are still thinking regional in terms of energy market, rather than having a comprehensive plan that if we want to push more in the net zero transition, should be something at least in terms of mechanism and efficiency, we should look much more. In the net zero, I think the next step is to deliver on investment for the net zero. The Commission is estimating that we need 500 billion investment per year more than what we are doing. At the moment, that's a huge increase from the 700 billions that we have so far. But this, again, requires a lot of common policies and common strategies among member states, partly on the regulatory part, partly in terms of infrastructure and also the network, partly in terms of coordination of public and private sector, and partly in terms of efficiency of regulation and also availability of skills. That is something that is quite important. If I still have a couple of minutes, I wanted to then enter in what does it mean also for European competitiveness. And I think my partial positive answer is on the response to the energy crisis in the short term. But we still have to see how Europe will be able to cope in the longer term with this strong commitment for the net zero transition, and at the end with an energy market that is still developing and where we cannot count, at least at the moment, for sure, on the low and stable energy prices. So there is a lot to do in the transformation part. And this is particularly a challenge for Central Eastern Europe. I think Central Eastern Europe was particularly relying, partly on the German value chain on the one side, but also the whole industrial sector in Central Eastern Europe was very much relying on the cheap Russian gas to competitiveness. And the transformation of some of the industries in the region is particularly challenging because it requires not only the internal decision at the factory level, but in many cases of the full transformation of the global value chain and what the global value chain will decide on future production. So it's something that becomes a difficult and complicated coordination plan. What we start seeing, and that's something that comes from our own research, we start looking at energy-intensive industries in Europe overall and in Central Eastern Europe, and what are the incentives to transform. We were looking at the manufacturing sector, and particularly at the most energy-intensive industry, and what drives their decision to transform and change technology into less energy-intensive areas of business or technologies. And what you see is actually that the ones that move faster in this transformation are actually the best firms. So are those with a better management practice, more digital, are really the ones that are pushed, and the parties, the value chain push you to the transformation. But what is interesting for me, and those are some preliminary analysis, is actually that there may be something wrong in the region in terms of incentives. So the incentive coming from being the best firm linked to the value chain is on the positive side. But on the other side, there are some wrong incentives coming from grants. We see that while for Europe overall, the most energy-intensive industry that receive more grants are those that transform, and the others don't get incentive and don't get grants. In Central Eastern Europe, all firms, very energy-intensive, receive grants. And also the banking sector is not yet the one forcing firms to transform. Actually, credit-constrained firms are equally in those that are high energy-intensive, transforming or non-transforming. So there is a part of incentive, and my sense is that it's coming also from a lot of internal protectionism, if you want, but also it has a good reason to be in terms of having the right speed of transformation, but it risks derailing the transformation. And if you are bound to be part of a global value chain, if you delay too much, you may be out for the future in terms of continuing to fulfill your role. So for Central Eastern Europe, I think we are at an important point in time with the transformation related also to fit properly the incentive schemes. I think I close here. I will come later in the discussion on the external rule.
Thank you very much, Debora. I think it's a topic which we might want to deepen in further discussion. This, I think I alluded to it in the previous discussion, the adaptability of European corporate structures, and you pointed out the different potential challenges in Central Eastern Europe as in the rest. And I think we can pick up also some of Misha Glenny's points, technology challenges and challenges in critical minerals, how we envision the adaptability of European corporate structure. And I think on the policy level, we know there's a lot of discussion and policy documents on EU industrial policy, how we evaluate what is going on there. So let me come next to Maria. Thank you for joining us up there. And I think we just let you speak on the topics you chose. Maria.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Michael, and a very good afternoon. I am in Brussels. I'm sorry I couldn't join you today. I actually loved the points that Debora made, because I think whatever we see now in terms of policy in the context of the EU, but also the country level, has all to do with rethinking our own competitiveness in a global scene. So all of the efforts that we're making, be it on energy or otherwise, is about trying to reestablish, to ascertain a new position of competitiveness in the global economic sphere. So with that, I think this is a very good basis for understanding the motivation behind all the actions that we see, given, of course, the shocks that come to us, which are sometimes entirely unpredictable, the pandemic, now the war. And yet again, I think Europe is in absolutely in very important crossroads in terms of identifying how it can achieve the welfare and achieve and maintain the welfare that it has. I want to make a couple of points which are a lot more zoomed in. When you first asked me to think about the topic, I sort of looked back in the past year and tried to understand where we are now. How are we different today than we were, let's say, a little bit more than a year ago before the start, before the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. And I just want to give you a couple of numbers because I think they provide an important context in terms of our economic ability to withstand the shocks and what happens next. The first one I would say is the cost. The cost of this to the European economy, we see it every day on inflation in our countries, very different between different countries, but we need to deal with the fact that inflation will stay with us for some time, something that we hadn't seen in a very long time and something that we need to get accustomed to yet again. But on the fiscal side, huge fiscal stimulus to try and sustain both households and firms of the order of magnitude of the fiscal support that was given also in the pandemic. So yet again, the countries had to come to the rescue of a very big and important shock that is putting households and firms at complete disadvantage. Just to give you the number, 657 billion is the amount of government support that has been given to both households and firms, and it's very similar, let's say, to the Next Generation EU. 750 billion was that. So you can see that it is really quite a big amount. In the UK alone, it was 103 billion. And, you know, for some of the countries in the EU, this fiscal support that was given represents a huge component of GDP. The biggest is in Slovakia, where it's 9% of its annual GDP, and in Germany, it's 7% of their GDP. So big fiscal help. Yet again, the fiscal part is crucial in trying and sustain welfare in our societies. An important other number, which is a good reflection of the cost, is the amount that the European Union has paid Russia for energy, and that is 140 billion. It represented last year about 45% of the Russian government budget, which I think is important to maintain, because it explains why the shock to the Russian economy hasn't been as big as we might have liked. However, there is good news also, as Debora said, and the good news comes very much on this decoupling that also Debora described. We have seen a 76% reduction of EU imports from Russia when it comes down to gas. Now, most of it, of course, has come from the fact that we simply stopped buying from Russia and turns elsewhere. But it also was added very much by the fact that, again, as Debora said, that we managed to reduce our demand for gas by 12%. Something, by the way, that is absolutely essential that we sustain in this year as well, in 2023, simply because there isn't enough gas to go around. And now that also China has opened up, this becomes a very important issue, trying to maintain lower levels of demand, even though the price now is back to what it was before the start of the war. Similar things on oil. We now estimate that the dependence on Russian oil is about 3%. It used to be 25% before the war, but all of this is now reduced to a very small amount, 3%. And of course, it is primarily due to the fact that we now have imposed, since the beginning of the year, the December of last year, we've now imposed sanctions on imports of Russian oil. But all of this to say that we are really decoupling from Russia, not totally when it comes to energy. We did a little exercise the other day in which we try and estimate in current prices and in current flows, what are we going to pay to Russia this year for energy? And in current estimates, we anticipate that we will pay 29 billion, down from 140 from last year. There is an opportune scenario and a bad scenario, but as a baseline, 29 is our best estimate. Just to compare this to what we used to pay to Russia before the war, it was in excess of 100 billion, sometimes 110, sometimes 123. So in terms of energy, we are decoupling, and hopefully we will totally decouple in the course of the year. In terms of the rest of the trade that we do with Russia, it had always been small for us, the EU. It has been bigger for Russia, but it is small for us. And it's almost, with the sanctions now, the 11th package to come soon, the economic ties with Russia and any other goods apart from energy are as good as nullified. Now, this decoupling is, of course, part of the bigger picture of trying to do something that, a new strategy that the EU is adopting, which is called de-risking. Now, I am a big fan of the word de-risking, and the reason why I'm a big fan is because it makes economic sense. It's interesting that Michael, in his introductory remarks, talked about the primacy of economics is now being taken by the primacy of politics. Of course, I understand that, and the geopolitical relevance of events. But I think it's important to remember that economic policies that do not have good economic basis are not credible. and therefore they will not happen. And de-risking, in my view, is a much better term of describing a direction of travel. Let me say a few words on this, because I think there's a lot being discussed on how to move forward in terms of economic model, and of course in terms of acquiring the competitiveness that Debora talked about. Originally, and a strategy that the US is trying to follow vis-a-vis China, of course, which is the big partner here, is one of decoupling. Decoupling had never been an issue for the EU, and it is a policy that makes very poor economic sense, simply because it's not possible. It is not possible to decouple, even for a country like the US from China. The European Union instead talked about something called strategic autonomy, and again, for me, strategic autonomy is a very elusive term, and it means different things to different people. But actually, if you actually look at the issues discussed next to strategic autonomy, they're typically motivated by protectionist instincts. And in my view, they achieve economically inferior outcomes that, at the very least, aggravate our partners. De-risking, on the other hand, is a strategy that is motivated by the need to diversify. And the outcome of de-risking is greater resilience. And this is why I think de-risking is a very good way of framing the discussion. Now, there's a few things that de-risking is and a few things that it's not. Interesting, and with a view to sort of talking about the political relevance, the geopolitical relevance of events, I think it's important to remember that, for example, the reduction of supply chains, a trend that had started with the pandemic and is I think is continuing as we speak, is a strategy that doesn't have necessarily it's not necessarily a bad economic decision. I mean, if your objective is to ensure business continuity, then reducing the length of supply chains doesn't necessarily have to be an act of political aggravation. It is good economic policy to try and have resilient supply chains, and therefore supply chains that are not as long as the previously has been. But what de-risking is not, in my view, and I think it's important to remember, in particular with some of the new suggestions that are coming forward and in response to some of the policies that the US has taken, de-risking is not about reducing our dependencies or eliminating our dependencies. We will need to have some dependencies simply because we need them for sustaining our economies. And you know, here I want to give the example of the Net Zero Act that the European Commission is putting forward. There are some suggestions there to try and make sure that we produce clean tech technologies by 2030 to the order of 40%. If you look at the current production of clean techs, this target seems, certainly for some of these technologies, looks unreachable. It's not a credible target to have, and it's going to be economically very inefficient, very costly. If it is very costly, it means that it will not happen, and therefore it is counterproductive. So I think we need to think about de-risking in the context of policies that make a good economic sense. If you allow me, just a word on Ukraine, because I think the topic of our conversation is Ukraine, and of course it is a very big part of the discussion nowadays. We've seen the discussions in Brussels just a few days ago between the Germans and the French on how to rethink enlargement and how to rethink about reforming the decision-making body of the EU in order to allow for this enlargement to happen. A very perhaps mundane view, but I think it's essential to remember that Ukraine needs to be thought of as a very special case. We cannot think about enlargement for Ukraine as we think about other countries. And just a few numbers to illustrate that. The cost of reconstruction is going to be at all orders of magnitude of Ukraine's GDP before the start of the war. This cannot happen in the context of just bilateral help. We need a bigger framework for helping restructure and rebuild Ukraine. There is 8 million people that have left the country, and 1 in 3 households nowadays is is what we call food insecure, so in great threat of hunger. So we cannot really think of Ukraine as we think about other countries when it comes to enlargement. Ukraine, in my view, will remain a very special case in this respect, and therefore we need to address help to Ukraine in the context of some form of enlargement. The last point, but I will raise a question rather than answer it, is global cooperation, in my view, is the answer to many of the problems that we're facing, particularly of the global public goods. And of course, global public goods have become a lot more more difficult to address as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And it's important to reflect on how we can go back to a system of global cooperation that can make an advance on this issue. But perhaps I'll stop here and come back to this in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, covering rather important and complementary topics. I think one is this element of pragmatism, how to adjust policies in this context of changing trade relations. You emphasize de-risking. I think it's still an untested concept. Sounds reasonable for diversification of risk and so on. But how it will work out in practice in relations to which particular regions of Europe and so on, and its global regions, and we have to see how it is going to be done. I think you followed up some of the topics of Debora on how supply chains adjust in this rather complex trade policy environment. I think potential tensions between the US and Europe in terms of relations to China, I think it's a topic which will continue for some time, also depending on changes in the US politically. I think a topic which we will cover also in the next section, but I'll be interested also for Debora to come back on that, is how EU support for Ukraine is going to evolve. EIB is one of the players, but I think the coordination amongst many players is a very complex issue. So I think from both of you, it will be nice to deepen our assessment, basically, of how EU policy structures might evolve. So now we are moving to different areas, basically neighborhood policy, enlargement perspectives, etc. And we start with Florian Bieber. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'll start with what has been mentioned previously is exactly what has been the impact of not just the Russian attack on Ukraine, but also the unprecedented fast offer of the EU of candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova for the enlargement process. Now, I was last year in a discussion with a colleague from the DG NIR responsible for enlargement, and when confronted with new ideas about enlargement, he said, normally we EU officials say two things to new ideas. Either it's impossible or we are already doing it. But he acknowledged that this might be a time when actually there might be a third option of actually contemplating something new. So this is, of course, the opening, which not just the war itself, but also the Ukrainian persistence on joining the European Union has brought with it. So on a symbolic level, the offering of candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova has been a major shift in the European Union, as needless to say here. But of course, we don't know yet what it means in practice. We have no idea, and again, the aforementioned conversation between the French and the German leadership attests to the fact that we don't have yet the clarity of what the symbolic gesture means. We've seen a number of follow-up symbolic gestures in the Western Balkans, such as granting the status for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which had been waiting as a kind of signal to say that the Western Balkans are not forgotten. But the question is really, has there really been a Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz called it right after the beginning of the war, when it comes to enlargement? And I would argue that, in fact, there's a paradox. There is maybe a bit of a Zeitenwende when it comes to Brussels, and there's very little of a Zeitenwende when it comes to the Western Balkans. And I will conclude on looking at both sides with a bit of a warning of the kind of overly geopolitical lens in which I believe the European Union, but also the United States, looking at both the Western Balkans as well as enlargement. So the third option of the EU official, which had become possible, is one to rethink the enlargement process. Because it's abundantly clear that the Ukraine, while a special case in terms of the financial needs and also the moral urgency, has to be part of a process which requires certain, adoptions of EU acquis and other mechanisms, which, as France has made it very clear, cannot be short-circuited. And I think most other EU member states agree that there cannot be another way to join than the kind of fundamental alignment of the acquis. But at the same time, the process which has been ongoing has been leading nowhere. This year is the 20th, you could call it, anniversary of the Declaration of Thessaloniki, which promised EU membership to the Western Balkans. And, so far, one country has joined, Croatia, but none of the other countries are even close to joining. So they will wait for the 25th, 30th, or even beyond that anniversary of the promise made by the European Union. That is a tremendously long time. This is one generation, right, which has been waiting with the promise on offer. So telling Moldova, Ukraine, and potentially Georgia that you're welcome, please get in queue for a process which will probably take at least 2-3 decades is hardly very encouraging. So the benefit of the very loud knocking on the door of the European Union has been to rethink this process, which most analysts have said for years is broken. And one of the many, the result has been quite significant thinking about different ways to make it work better. So ideas which have been, kicked around is the idea of including, expanding the single market to the Western Balkans or to other countries seeking to join, or more prominently recently, the idea of staged accession, i.e. the idea that you don't just join in one big bang, but you join across multiple steps and you, in a certain way, benefit from structural funds, from other funds, participate in the institutions before you have the full rights and privileges of membership. And I believe this discussion is very useful, although it still hasn't run its course and we still don't have any clarity, both for Ukraine as well as for the Western Balkans and where this process is standing. But part of the problem is actually a sideshow, I would argue, because kind of returning to one of the great principles of modern architecture articulated in the late 19th century of form follows function. The EU has been very busy discussing form, but not so much the function of actually how to get the countries into an effective European Union. So we can have extensive discussions about new methodologies. This is something France insisted on when it vetoed North Macedonia and Albania. We came up with a new methodology which is not that different from the old one, and we can probably think of 5 or 6 new ones on top of that, but I doubt that they will structurally change the overall issue. The reason why Ukraine has been symbolically successful is for 2 reasons. I would say one, it mobilized the moral argument, which had been dwindling in the Western Balkans, although it was there 20 years ago, the moral argument of post-war European unification and dealing with a country subject of aggression in the case of Ukraine. And the other element is that, of course, Ukraine is very vocal in demanding or requesting membership, something which none of the Western Balkan countries is doing at the moment. There isn't any banging on the door to be heard from the Western Balkans. None of the governments are particularly eager. They say they're eager, but even the most eager ones are not really banging. They're maybe softly knocking at best. And this is connected with the fundamental challenge. Enlargement is a process built on political will. The process itself is a function of the political will, both of the countries seeking to join as well as of the European Union itself. And this is something which has really failed and dwindled away in the case of the Western Balkans. There is no longer that political will on both sides. And that is, in a certain way, the question: how can we rekindle, the hope or the political will? And Ukraine's request for membership is certainly one opportunity to give it, the whole process, greater political urgency in Brussels. And we've seen that. And one of the benefits, certainly one can expect that the next commissioner in charge of enlargement is not going to be a loyalist of one of Europe's own autocrats, who is certainly not exactly best suited to promote enlargement based on values and rule of law. Now, in the Western Balkans, on the other side, we've also seen an erosion of trust in the European project. We don't really have pro-European governments anymore, in the sense of governments which do everything necessary to move the countries to join the European Union. It doesn't mean that they're not rhetorically committed to join the European Union, but they're not really willing to do what it takes. Now, of course, the many painful experiences over the last decade show that, in a certain way, risking too much gets you in trouble. Look at North Macedonia, which did a lot and changing its name and other compromises and got very little for it, and is mocked openly by some of its neighbors. So that's not exactly sending a very encouraging message. So this is the irony is that while both the enthusiasm for EU enlargement has not scaled up after the war and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it's also that there has not been a larger geopolitical shift in the region in terms of positioning towards Russia or against Russia. Serbia, which had a pro-Russian, a partly pro-Russian ambiguous foreign policy before the war, is persisting with it until today. And so are its allies across the region. So from that point of view, there is no large geopolitical shift we're seeing in the Western Balkans as a result of the war. And this is in a certain way quite surprising that no realignment occurred, and it shows to some degree the weakness of the gravitational pull of the European integration and Euro-Atlantic structures to really lead to a decisive shift at that moment. And that brings me to my third and concluding point, and that is that one of the downsides of already a commission which called itself Geopolitical, confronted with the Russian aggression, has become more geopolitical when it comes to enlargement. While on one side I said enlargement requires political will, if politics trumps values and norms, we are in trouble indeed. And I would argue that the European Union's engagement in the Western Balkans has, in a certain way, emphasized the main message of trying to restrict Russian influence in the Western Balkans, rather than focusing on norms and values. And this has been very much assisted by the United States, which again looks at the Western Balkans and Europe at the moment as mostly a place to stop Russian influence rather than any other issue. So we see, as a result, that one ignores domestic problems, the lack of democracy, or challenges to rule of law, which are fundamental to joining the European Union, and is more interested in blocking Russia. And by doing so, easily sides with the wrong governments, or is uncritical of governments in the region. And this is, I think, really undermines the whole value-based, rule of law-based approach of the European Union to the Western Balkans. So we are in a paradoxical situation where on one side there is a lack of political will for enlargement, but there seems to be a political will for other agenda issues which actually dampen in many ways the substance of enlargement when it comes to the Western Balkans. So based on that, I would say that the war in Ukraine has surprisingly shifted little as of yet when it comes to the enlargement process in the Western Balkans, and still raises the larger question of how, beyond the symbolic gestures of last year, to actually reinvigorate these processes, both for the Western Balkans as well as for the countries such as Ukraine and Moldova, which have applied. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. There's one point which I would like you to address later on in more depth, is the concepts of staged accession. I think many analysts now think this is the big hope for turning things around and at least making it manageable in terms of learning from the experience of the Western Balkans in relation to Ukraine and Moldova, and of course also rekindling, as you say, a spirit of some optimism in dealing with the Western Balkans. I didn't fully understand your criticism or what alternative concept you would have, but probably you can come back to that. Günay, you're next.
I'm sorry, because you've already painted a rather dark picture, and I'm going to paint it even darker, I feel. Maybe I'll start with on a positive note and then deconstruct this positive note. I think after the outbreak of the war, most Europeans were kind of relieved that there was a unified Europe standing against Russian aggression. And there was also the feeling that the United States are back and supporting Europe strongly, and they haven't abandoned us, because that was the feeling like after the pivot to the East. But unfortunately, and this brings me to the dark picture, it's rather superficial. On the one hand, I think a unified Europe, the fight for democracy, for our values, we stand with Ukraine, is actually a fragile coalition of certain governments within the European Union, and it's not really representing the whole European societies. We see the dangers of right-wing extremist parties winning one election after the other. France, Austria, and in Hungary, we do already have a pro-Russian government, if you like. So what happens if this fragile coalition breaks apart? How sustainable is this unified stance against Russian aggression? And the second part is, which is also complementing the dark picture, is that the return of the United States, the revival of the transatlantic partnership, basically it's just a revival of the military cooperation part. There is no real political cooperation behind this revival, even though President Biden continuously refers to the fight of democracies against autocracies. It's rather a rhetorical tool that has also a domestic dimension, certainly after the events of the 6th of January, 2 years or 3 years ago almost, yeah. So it's fragile, and this points me to the or brings me to the consequences for enlargement and integration, and also the European neighborhood policy. First of all, the European Union has been for quite some time in a crisis regarding its strategy. What do we actually want? What kind of Europe do we imagine? What is Europe after all? Where does it end? Where does it start? All these questions haven't been resolved. And I think this crisis of, if you like, strategy or identity has not just started with the war in Ukraine, but probably we can see even more see the strange reactions to the war and its effects as signs of these weaknesses. As Florian mentioned, instead of, well, let me put it in another way, the European Union has not been able so far to develop any foreign policy tool that is different from accession or approximation. And this only works in an environment where you're the strongest guy. It doesn't work in an environment which is more and more characterized by a marketplace, a political marketplace where you have different actors competing with you. So the European Union is still stuck, if you like, in the notion of a liberal world order that is in decline, certainly, a world order that was, and certainly still is to a certain extent, dominated by Western powers, but where you have more and more challenges to this European and American dominance in the world order. China, Russia, but also allies of the West, as Turkey, for instance, that claim to have a stronger say. And you would have expected from, as a reaction to the war, also in the continuity of its own strategy, that the war would have speeded up the integration processes in the Western Balkans, or also opened new channels in debates with Turkey. But none of this happened. Instead, the European Union continued its flawed strategy to offer new accession perspectives to a country like Ukraine, which is just not credible. And this is one of the other problems, that the European Union has lost a lot of credibility in its immediate neighborhood, because also people in these countries feel and know and see the experiences of the Western Balkans and Turkey, that this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. Now I get lost in my notes. Give me just a second. Yeah, and one of the reasons why the European Union is just unable to produce or develop new strategies is because its recent or previous strategy was very strongly built on the transatlantic partnership. It was mainly the United States that kind of pushed for enlargement, whether it was the case in the case of Eastern enlargement or the Western Balkans, but also Turkey's accession process. Once the United States have kind of withdrawn from their normative claim to promote democracy and stabilize Europe, the European Union and European societies haven't been able to develop any schemes that are independent from this previous perspective. So there was a kind of labor division. Also, when you look into the neighborhood, the United States were kind of responsible for hard power politics, military cooperation, security politics, and the like, whereas the European Union was kind of promoting the soft power. As I mentioned, approximation through the promotion of norms and standards, of European norms and standards, support for civil society organizations, but also for pro-democracy groups. All these things have somehow disappeared. If you look just at these recent elections in Turkey, there was no kind of vital sign from the European. I can understand that the European Commission is probably not the best place to kind of support democracy in Turkey, but from none of the European member states came any positive signs. And there was even an article yesterday in the Daily Telegraph which had the headline, "Europe breathes sigh of relief because Erdogan wins." And I guess this is partly true, because it is better the devil you know. It is he's kind of holding back refugees. Turkey has become an important pool for refugees coming from more eastern and southern countries on their way to Europe. And this is also the way how the European Union has increasingly perceived not only Turkey, but the whole Mediterranean region, through the perspective and through the eyes of security, and mainly through the lens of migration policies. Another example for the lack of kind of values and this is at the same time what the European claims for itself, that it is actually a norm-based actor in the region. But another example for the lack of these norms is Tunisia. Once a country praised as a success story for democratization and European democracy promotion, has unfortunately become increasingly authoritarian under President Said. And I've looked up, there is no reaction from the EU whatsoever. Nothing, no criticism. So this is what I'm referring to as a crisis of ideas and strategy. On the one hand, the EU tries to keep up its kind of normative claim, and on the other hand, it is kind of betraying its own normative claims. And particularly if you look at North Africa, this region that was once seen as an important partner in the European neighborhood policy scheme, and the idea was to create a ring of stable and at least democratizing societies in this region. And actually the Arab Spring provided a moment that opened new channels for this. Instead, the European Union has continued its policies also after the Arab Spring that mainly built on economic liberalization, trade liberalization, and gradually withdrew from its normative claim. And as I already mentioned, most of the policies towards the Mediterranean region are now characterized by Europe's migration problem, Europe's problem with migration as such. And this, on the other hand, of course, has increased the leverage in the southern parts of the Mediterranean, the southern shores. Governments in these countries are well aware that this is a kind of pressure tool you can use against the European Union. We also know Tayyip Erdogan has already used it in the past. And at the same time, this overly focus on migration and security and the withdrawal or the abandonment of normative claims has also kind of harmed the EU's alliances with certain groups in these societies. It's pro-democracy groups that are the most disappointed about Europe, and which see a hypocrisy in European policies. And last but not least, as a sign of Europe's decreasing kind of normative impact throughout the region are the reactions to Russia's invasion in Ukraine. None of these, or most parts of these societies, let alone the governments, did not buy into the European narrative of a unified stance against aggression, but they see in many ways also faults on the European side. And I think this is something which needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cengiz. I think for the sake of...
Yes, unfortunately.
For the sake of time, I think I will take questions from the floor in a minute and probably give a round to the panelists afterwards. I think probably one point I want to pick up, and probably Maria might want to address that. I think Cengiz was pointing out this sort of Stackelberg behavior by the European Union in relation to the US, that transatlantic relationship is really driven by the US, and the EU doesn't have any active role. I was just wondering whether Maria sees some elements of the EU becoming an agent of its own in terms of, and linked to that in a way, well, you were pointing out EU plays the role of soft power versus hard power, but of course there is a lot of scope for soft power in economic policy terms. I wouldn't denigrate trade, investment policy, infrastructure policy, skills, training, circular migration ideas, and so on. So I think these are important components of EU's relation to the neighborhood. Whether much is going on there is another question, but I think it is something which I think we should really push, that it is an important agenda. So let me come to the audience. There is a question or comment over there.
There is one point I would like to add and to put the questions later. About 30 years ago, in the 1990s, we had a fiercely discussion in Europe about enlargement and deepening of the European Union. Deepening, something what Mr. Günay more or less circumscribed as having ideas for the European Union and so on. And I can only observe that this discussion seems to be dead. We do not discuss about deepening anymore, and what I hear sometimes is plain rhetoric and illusion, in my view. And now my question is, with respect to all this enlargement debate, I heard the term enlargement only in this panel. What are the risks and benefits of enlargement without deepening of the European Union? Can we find a concept of deepening the European Union when we enlarge, simply?
Okay, we get the point. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, just next to you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, my name is Nina Vujanovic from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a short question for Florian Bieber. What is your opinion about the Open Balkan initiative, which is supposed to gather these countries that are waiting for so long to get into the EU? Is it really a good initiative, meaning that it can bring the region together, maybe even prepare them for the European Union, or is it really a hopeless action of countries that gave up? Yes.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Yeah, just here, Mario? Okay. Next. There was one here and then in the back, yeah. You come next, yeah.
Marcus Howe from the Insight. I guess this question is particularly to Florian Bieber. How would you explain the policy of the Biden administration towards the Western Balkans, particularly having in mind developments with Serbia and Kosovo in the last months? I mean, it really feels that for Kosovo, they may as well have Trump and Grenell back. And, you know, in the past, I think it feels that the US has chosen to play bad cop with the wrong side. So your thoughts on that would be appreciated.
And the last, oh, okay. One before last. Yeah, he's first and then you.
All right, thank you very much for this very interesting panel discussion. All questions go to Mr. Bieber, I think. Again, Western Balkans. So my name is Bernd Christoph Ström. I'm a country expert and analyst at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, and I'm focused on Croatia. And we were talking about enlargement, and the question before me about the problems of enlargement. I think this is also, I think it is also important to address demographic decline, brain drain, which is currently happening in the entire Western Balkan region. And the hopes were high, especially for Croatia, that the brain drain from Croatia to the European Union would stop with the inclusion of Croatia into the European Union. So now Croatia is since January this year a Schengen member, Euro member, in full integration, but you still have the decline in the educated labor workforce. So my question is, what can be done to counter these negative demographic trends?
Okay.
I think those should be addressed as well. Thank you.
Veronica. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Veronica Movchan, Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting, Kiev, Ukraine. And my question is to Mr. Günay. You said that the EU promise of enlargement is not credible, it will not happen. But what is the solution? You have a big, dark picture. What EU could have offered instead?
Thank you. I think we'll stop here, otherwise we encroach too much on the next panel. Debora, you want to start off with, you can pick any of the topics. Yeah.
I think we are in a very dark mood. So I would like to start actually answering to the question on enlargement and deepening, whether the EU is doing nothing. I think at the end we forget a couple of things that I think are quite important in terms of transformation at the European level. The response to the pandemic at the Recovery and Resilience Facility, it's true that was for now, actually, it has been presented as a single occasion, not to be repeated, exceptional case, but was a very important example of what Europe can do in a united way to answer to a shock, a sudden shock. And that's, I would see it as an important positive response if we wanted to find the positive side. And the other one, the Croatia, not only the accession, but the adoption of the euro. It shows that the countries that engage in the transformation process, in the entry into the EU, entry into the euro, and do all the right steps and have the right process, actually can do it. And Croatia was a very good example of doing the right thing at the right moment and moving forward in a very easy way of preparing the entrance to the euro area at the end. So at the end, there are a lot of dark view, but I also think that there is some positive to see in terms of the capacity of Europe to transform on the one side and the deepening part, even if it always takes time, and good example of countries that by doing all the reforms, they actually can move along the process. On Ukraine in particular, I agree with what has been said before. Is going to be a complex case of accession. I think it was extremely important to have a clear message toward Ukraine at a certain moment and giving this firm anchor in terms of policy and economic anchor, actually, to the current environment. I think it has to be a single case in the sense that the complexity of what the accession of Ukraine will bring in terms of size, in terms of integrating into European policies is going to be, I think it should be treated as a separate case also from compared to other countries and managed in a different way. I think that one important lesson may be also associated to the difficulty of many other countries in advancing to the process is that the accession process is complex. And also when resources arrive, managing resources also, and I'm thinking for the construction of Ukraine, will be difficult. And difficult in also in terms of respecting compliance, respecting all the rules that are associated to large donors' money that enter, but also economic resources for the private sector coming for the reconstruction. And I think an effort that it has to start as soon as possible is really to, and I saw actually that we have the right speech in a moment, but it's really creating the condition already inside Ukraine for really building the technical capacity for in the future managing all the reconstruction resources and all the transformation. And I think a lot it has also to do on the capacity on countries to deliver.
Thank you. Since the economists take a slightly more positive note on the agenda, leave Maria for the end, yeah? And to end with more, and give Florian and Cengiz. Yeah.
Thanks. Political scientists might get a bad reputation. No, I mean, first of all, I think to the question of staged accession, I mean, I think what you asked me, and I do think it's a promising approach to deal with it. I think my comment was not to say we shouldn't have maybe a better way of handling, and I think staged accession is probably the best model which could accommodate also Ukraine in different, that basically different countries get different access to the EU in different speeds because it allows for kind of quick symbolic inclusion, financial inclusion, but also then the full membership might take a little bit longer, but it's more bearable. So I think that's useful. I think the problem is just that we get lost in the discussion about the technicalities, and we have to realize that it's about the political will of the EU and the country to join to complete this process. And if you don't have that, you can have the best process in the world, and it's not going to work. If the countries get the message, well, my next neighbor will block me, another neighbor will block me, another EU member state will block me, then you give up hope. And this is what happened in the Western Balkans. So that North Macedonia is kind of, and neighbors see that. They see, okay, this country's made all these efforts, and it's again, at first it was blocked by France, and then it's blocked by Bulgaria, and it's kind of not going to get out of that. It has domestic repercussions, it has repercussions for the neighbors. And this is, I think, crucial. On a couple of the questions, first of all, deepening versus widening. And I think this was always a flawed dichotomy because they happen usually together. And I would agree that a lot of deepening has occurred in recent years. It's just not treaty-based deepening, but it's functional deepening which has occurred. Of course, there needs to be some treaty-based deepening, especially when it comes to dealing with rule of law issues, but we know it's very difficult when you have governments in power who have no interest in that. I think one element certainly to include some better rules would be actually in the accession process, because when a country joins, you have to change the treaty, you have to in a certain way have a ratification process, so minor adjustments of the treaty might be possible actually when the next countries join in a package, so to speak. Maybe not a full-fledged treaty change, but something, which shows again how in fact deepening and widening could come together. Open Balkans, the question, I'm very skeptical about the Open Balkans because it's intransparent, it's unclear what the goals are, and I don't trust the people who promote it in the Western Balkans because they're neither Democrats nor they're committed to EU integration. So I think a lot of it is rebranding other types of regional integration which already exist, and which would be better to pursue in a non-confrontational way, which include all of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans. And the Open Balkans, of course, is only half of the Balkans, and that's not really very helpful. So that's my point. On the Biden politics towards the Western Balkans, I think I would very much kind of echo what Cengiz was saying to the broader political picture, but I would also agree that I mean, there is much more continuity between the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Western Balkans than anybody, including myself, would have expected. And I think a lot of it is based on the logic that countries like Kosovo are anyhow American allies and EU allies, so you can be a lot more rude to them than you can be to those who are, on the fence. In a certain way, the problem is that you might gain some short-term gains from kind of accommodating the capricious, but you undermine strategic allies, and also you encourage this kind of behavior. I mean, basically, the Serbian government has been going around and saying, all of you who are just putting all your eggs in the EU Western basket are fools because you can't bargain with them. And basically, it's this Trumpist, everything is a deal. And, if you have more bargaining power, you get a better deal. And if you buy into that, you completely abandon the idea there's anything value-based about this. And this might work for other regions of the world where the relationship is purely diplomatic and based on a certain way exchange. But it comes to the Western Balkans, it should be about something else because there is this commitment of joining Euro, maybe not Atlantic, but at least European structures. And I think it is undermining, and I think the US policy at the moment is hurting the region and encouraging the worst of European politics towards the region. And the last question, I'll just address in one sentence when it comes to the demographic question. I mean, yes, Croatia has lost more than the population of the second largest city, namely Split, since it joined the European Union. And of course, we're starting to see the same in the rest of the Western Balkans. I mean, many areas are depopulated, and in fact, you don't get enough labor for making new investments work. I mean, factories, investments only work with Chinese or exploited Vietnamese workers. If you go to around Belgrade, you see in the service and in the industry sector, large number of migrants employed on often very precarious contracts from the Philippines, from Cuba, from all over the world. So we're actually seeing the rapid transformation of the Western Balkans from an emigrant to an immigrant society. And of course, that's the only solution at the end of the day. But of course, it's one which probably will meet a lot of far right-wing backlash as the societies are not at all prepared to become all of a sudden societies where people don't just pass through, but where they might actually stay, live, and build up lives. And so the term Gastarbeiteri, which is commonly used, of course, might have a very different meaning in the years to come for the Western Balkans.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. And honestly, I'm usually an optimist. You wouldn't believe, but I'm an optimist. And I think it's not to paint a dark picture just because you want it to be dark, but I think it's important to acknowledge the reality, and this is one of the problems when it comes to EU external relations, or when it offers accession processes to countries where I feel like it's not realistic. Because if you look at the current accession processes, none of these countries have become members of the European Union. And if you look at the effects, if you kind of create hope, then the fall is even deeper. In the long term, mid and long term, EU accession and failed accession processes have actually supported non-democratic movements and populist leaders across the Western Balkans and also in Turkey. So it's not only to blame the EU, but it has certainly played a role to create hope and then not fulfill what you kind of promise people. No one has asked me, but I want to say something also about how to probably shift and change politics towards the European neighborhood. I don't have a very simple recipe, but I think it starts with recognizing your own capabilities and capacities and understand where you are in the world. Colleagues have called it decentering Europe, regionalizing Europe. We are not the center of the whole world. And I think this is a very important first step to acknowledge. The second one is to understand, particularly when it comes to relations with North Africa, the colonial past of Europe and European powers. It still plays an important role, and it certainly contributes to anti-Western discourses in these countries, and also supports anti-Western politicians or policy actions. So maybe one thing could be to start relations at eye level and not trying to continuously promote your own experiences, your own model as the only valuable one, but understand that there are also more options.
Thank you, Cengiz. Maria?
Okay, thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating, the discussion. Just a few points also to contribute on this deepening versus widening. I mean, certainly for the past 15 years, since the last wave of enlargement, all we've done in Europe is the deepening. I mean, if you think about the crisis mechanisms culminating, of course, the next generation EU, and evidence is telling us that actually the next generation EU has allowed countries to pass very difficult structural reforms, which otherwise, without the carrot of a grant, wouldn't have actually passed. So this is very encouraging. However, I think it is an illusion to think that enlargement and deepening can go hand in hand without serious change in our decision-making process. I think so. In the context of a current treaties, therefore, that's what one of the previous speakers said, cannot really, in my view, happen. But a change of treaty is a change of vision. And that is important. If we are going to go forward, we need to require a change of vision of what we want Europe to do, which isn't something that we can decide from one year to the next. Now, I wanted to say something about values, because it is actually the issue of the discussions on values is both very important, but also quite problematic. It is, of course, we're very proud of the value system that we have, and it is not unreasonable to demand that countries that join the EU share the same values. I think that is absolutely essential. But the next step in the logical process tells you also that there are limits to enlargement if values is going to be the cornerstone of this process. There isn't an infinite process of enlargement if we are going to base it, as indeed we should, on the issue of values. And we have to be a little bit careful about that when we engage in international negotiations. And I think the last speaker also alluded to this point. And we invoke as our first negotiation tool the issue of values. When you're sitting around the table with the Chinese, and the first thing we say is that we have a value system that we need to adhere to, is not a very good negotiating tactic with a nation that feels extremely proud of its own value system, even though it's very different to us. So I think the issue here is, how do we make do in a global system that has got divergent value systems? And I think that's the important thing for Europe, finding a way to have relations and actually do business with in order to solve the big global problems like climate. Because if the first thing we say is that we don't negotiate with those that don't have the same value system, then climate is the first thing that will suffer. So I think we need to be a bit careful not to claim the moral high ground when we engage in international relations, and understand that, at least for our own home, value system is a very important one, but it also defines the limits of our yard. It is not infinite. On a positive note, because you've given me the responsibility of finishing on a positive note, I think the one thing that Europe can do and should do and can do very well is to be the defender of the multilateral system. This is why I think the US is actually a difficult partner when it comes to this. The whole world will benefit with a system of rules that we can help write. We cannot be the only ones who write that, but we can help write that in a way that is agreeable to everybody, and ensure that there is a rule book that we can all follow, so that we can sit around the table and actually discuss the bigger issues like climate and like war. I think this is absolutely essential, and it is in the DNA of the European Union to try and play that role. Some of you called it the soft power. I will put it rule-based system. I think that is one that actually will help us, and Europe does benefit from a strong multilateral system. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. You played your role well, ending up with, probably we can all agree with political scientists and economists, we are all constructive pragmatists with a vision. So I think it was a very rich discussion. Thank you very much, and I apologize for the next panel to shrink a little bit, but I think we'll probably shrink the lunch a bit, but instead of the many questions on Ukraine are still left open, and I think this will be addressed in the next panel. So Richard, and thank you very much for the panel.